It's the tradition of some Christians to end their Maundy Thursday worship by reflecting on the scriptures that tell us what happened to Jesus after he shared the Lord's Supper with his disciples. And that's how we're going to end our Maundy Thursday, by reflecting on those stories, by using some excerpts from Walter Wangerin's The Book of God. And so, as was his custom whenever he stayed in Jerusalem, Jesus came in the dark shadow of the night to the Mount of Olives, and there he stopped. "Stay here." Jesus' words were short. To 8 of the disciples he said, "Stay here while I pray." Touching Simon and James on their shoulders, then taking John's hand in his own, Jesus entered a private olive grove called Gethsemane. There was no light beneath those ancient trees, whose trunks were great twists of shadow. Jesus moved by memory. As he walked, breathing became difficult for him. His legs felt numb and heavy. "My soul," he groaned, "my soul is sorrowful, even unto death." He stopped. His throat was thickening. There was no controlling this anymore. "Wait here," he said, releasing John's hand, his voice sounding a little harsh. He knew it would get worse. He barked, "Watch with me," and rushed through the grove, the distance of a stone's throw, then stumbled and fell face down on the ground. He drove his fingers through the soil and howled, "Abba, Abba." And then the storm broke. Jesus wailed aloud from earth even unto heaven, "Abba, Father, take this cup away from me." Silence. Jesus breathed through his nostrils, his cheek in the dirt. No wind, no light, no sound. Not the rustling of leaves, nor the call of an evening insect. Nothing. Without lifting his head, by a terrible effort, Jesus uttered words more reasonable. "Father, all things are possible with you. You can abolish the cup. You can make this hour pass away from me." Sweat pooled in the bridge of his nose. It drizzled into his eyes, burning, and dropped to the earth as thick as blood. Jesus was suffering powerful oppositions. He wanted his prayer to be both truthful and obedient, but these seemed to be adversaries within him, each demanding his soul. Jesus retracted his lips and ground his teeth, and for a long while could utter nothing at all. But then he had brought his mind and his breathing and his horror under greater control, and he spoke the last part of his prayer in meek syllables. "Nevertheless, not my will, Abba," Jesus said, "but yours be done." He lay a while in perfect quietness, then weak, empty, and exhausted. Finally he rose up. His legs trembled under the natural weight of standing, but he was able to make his way back to James, Simon and John, and when he came to them his heart sank into deeper and deeper loneliness. Their bodies lay like sacks at the bases of 2 trees. By the slow draw of easy breathing, Jesus knew that they were sleeping, all 3. "What, Simon," he said to his oblivious disciple, "couldn't you watch 1 hour with me? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Jesus composed himself. By conscious thought, he stood erect and dignified, and then he saw small firelight below him at the foot of the Mount of Olives. So he bent to his disciples and shook them one by one awake. "Arise, look," he said, "look down the mountain. See, the hour has come. My betrayer is at hand." Simon snorted and then made a great show of being on guard and seeing the torch fires that wound up the path from the Kidron Valley, a long line of winking lights. Jesus went out of Gethsemane and began to rouse the rest of the disciples, and they too had been overwhelmed with weakness. They woke foolishly, clearing their throats, complaining like children, not quite comprehending where they were or what was about to happen. But then the smoking torches began to arrive. There came too the soft clashing of armour, scabbards, swords, and suddenly from three sides all at once soldiers appeared, troops and officers of Herod Antipas's armies, as well as captains of the temple guard. In front of them all, Jesus recognised a nervous little figure, a taut fellow whose torch blazed brighter and yet blacker than the others. Judas, mirroring a smile, his great eyebrow fairly flying from his head in a manic show of civility. Judas raised the torch above one disciple, then another, pouring into their faces, chattering, "Yes, yes, greetings to you, yes," and moving on. Jesus, watching the progress of the small zealot, suffered an enormous sadness. Finally, Judas spied Jesus where he stood. The man's mouth grew tighter in smiling, but his eyes swelled with begging. He began to bob his head as if Jesus and he shared secrets. He came so close to his teacher that Jesus could see the pores in his flesh. Loudly, Judas exclaimed, "Hail, Master!" And then he went up on his toes and he kissed Jesus. A servant of the high priest called, "Is that our man then?" Judas backed away, saying nothing, staring at Jesus. The servant began to stride forward with a knife and a rope. Suddenly, someone huge hurtled past Jesus, bellowing and slashing the air with a short sword. And Judas screamed, "Simon, Simon, Messiah is here!" Simon Peter struck the rope and the knife from the servant's hands and in a wild stroke cut off the man's ear. But Jesus sprang forward and grabbed Simon from behind. He tightened his left arm against the big man's throat and with his right hand stripped the weapon from Simon's fingers. "Put it down," Jesus growled in Simon's ear. "Those who take the sword perish by the sword." Simon went slack. Jesus released him. "Don't you know that I could ask my Father for 12 legions of angels and he would send them to me?" Jesus reached down and picked up the severed ear of the servant and touched it again to the side of the man's head and healed him. At the same time, he found Judas in the throng and glared at him. With a raw, specific condemnation, he declared, "But I would never ask my Father for such a thing, or else the scriptures would never be fulfilled." Little Judas dropped his torch. It seemed an involuntary act, yet he left it on the ground. He hesitated no more than the time it takes to shrug one's shoulders, and then just vanished. Jesus, now drawing himself erect before the captains of the temple, said, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to capture me like a robber? Day after day I have been in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me then. But," he said, starting to stride toward them, "this is your hour and the power of darkness." As if his word were their command, the soldiers also moved forward. In torchlight they began to bind Jesus' arms. One of the disciples bleated in fear. This was proving to be a very large contingent of soldiers. The more they filled the area around Jesus, the more the disciples shrank backward. Jesus watched as terror overtook his children, and they fled. Some crept away, some dodged and raced away, but they all scattered all of them, till no one was left, and Jesus was completely alone. Simon Peter. John left me alone. He disappeared. I had no idea where he went, and I had no friend in that place. And even as the servant was opening the gate, she kept staring into my face. That was unnerving enough. Then she spoke, and I glanced down at her, and that's how I lost sight of John in the courtyard. What she said was, "Aren't you one of that man's disciples?" Took my breath away. I'd just got there. "What man?" I said. "You know," she said, "the man they arrested." "No," I said. "No, I'm not." I brushed past her, and since John was nowhere in sight, I went to the fire in the middle of the courtyard, as if I had business in that place and knew exactly where I was going. It was a common fire on a cold night. Officers of the temple guard were warming themselves, servants too. I put out my hands and ducked my head down. Jesus was somewhere in the palace. I meant to stay. But that maid wouldn't leave me alone. Soon, I felt that people were looking at me. It made my flesh crawl. I glanced up, and there she was, talking to the officers. "This is one of them," she said. "He's a disciple of the Nazarene." "Woman," I said, "I don't know, and I do not understand what you are talking about." But I moved to the forecourt, a colder place, but darker too. I loved Jesus. I loved Jesus then. And that whole night, it was hard for me even to breathe because I kept seeing him tied up. He was somewhere in the high priest's house with people who wanted to kill him. How could I leave? I kept wringing my hands, helpless. I wanted to throw my body at the doors and burst in and beat them all with clubs. I don't know how long I'd been paced in that dark place, an hour maybe. But then, I'll tell this part as truthfully as I can, then 4 things happened, one right after the other. First, the shouting. All at once there came from an upper chamber the slurred shouts of many men. They were laughing as if they were drunk. I went back into the courtyard to see what was happening, but a soldier blocked my way and said, "You're one of them." I said, "No." He said, "Don't lie to me, you're a Galilean." I said, "No," and I tried to push past him, but he struck my chest and said, "Don't you recognise me?" He struck me again. "I was there when you cut off my cousin's ear." "Damn you," I yelled, "damn you." People started to look, people in the courtyard, people pouring out of the upper chamber. The guards reached for their weapons. It drove me crazy. I raised my right hand and screamed, "I swear by the city of Jerusalem that I know nothing of the man. I do not know." Then this is the third thing that happened. Jesus came out of the upper chamber, his arms bound behind him. He turned and looked down at me. He saw my right hand in the air. And this is the fourth thing. Somewhere in the night, a cock started to crow. I lowered my hand and covered my mouth, turned away from Jesus and ran out of the courtyard. I ran out into the city. I ran down a dark alley and fell to the ground with my face in my hands, and I burst into tears. I cried and I cried, and I could not stop. This is the whole truth.